Hello everyone, my name is Caroline Lee and I am a 2D and 3D motion designer. My background is primarily in broadcast design, but I also have experience in marketing and advertising as well. I've wanted to be an animator ever since I was a little girl. I grew up recreating the Sunday comics and loved all of the Disney movies. Once I saw Toy Story, similar 3D films, and how some of the Star Wars visual effects were created, I immediately fell in love and knew that this was what I wanted to do. The story behind any piece is what really moves me. I find myself drawn to pieces where I have a personal connection, and that's something that I try to replicate in my own work. I'm definitely fascinated by technical aspects like lighting, composition, and color, but it's that emotional connection that inspires me and my work. Today I'm going to cover how to use Cinema 4D as a storytelling asset and some of the steps in my workflow for creating style frames, still renders, and animations. So let's get started. So the first project we're going to go over today is this style frame here. This is a style frame that I recently completed for a personal piece that I'm working on. I've actually created several style frames, and the reason for doing so is because I typically like to build out style frames as part of the pre-production and creative development process. It allows me to visualize how the fully animated piece is going to look in the end, or at least some of the key moments. The part we're going to specifically go over is how to create this sort of shattering effect with the container that you see in the eye. I'm not someone who has experience building physical rigs, and nor the expertise or the skill to do it. So I went with the resources that I knew I had available to myself, and that was Cinema 4D. So I used 3D to create this visual storytelling asset, and that's what we're going to cover today. So let's jump into Cinema 4D and let's take a look at that. So before we jump into the simulation portion of the demonstration, I'm just going to quickly go over how I typically set up my 3D scenes. So I always start out with this customized Redshift layout so that I can sort of see what's happening in real time with Redshift. And then from there, I will build out just some quick organizational assets with a couple of nulls. So I'll drop 3 nulls into the scene, and those nulls will quickly become my light setup, my camera setup, and my scene setup. From there, I'll start out with some initial lighting, and that's typically this dome light here. So I'll drop in a dome light by going to Redshift tab, lights, and then dome light. And I'll either drop in an HDRI that I have of my own, or I'll use something like Grayscale Gorilla's HDRI link to add an asset there. I'll then build out the rest of these lights as I start to build out the scene, but always start out with that initial dome light. The next thing I'll do is I'll add a camera to the scene. Typically it'll be a Redshift camera, again, which you can go get by going up to the Redshift tab, cameras, and standard. I'll adjust the settings there to my desired focal length and so on and so forth. For this scene, you'll see that I have somewhat of a Dutch tilt effect to the camera to create some visual variety and visual interest in the overall piece. So once I got that to my liking, I then threw on a protection tag, which I can get by going to the tags tab. Oops, sorry, you have to have the object selected, tags. And then you can go down to rigging tags and protection, and this will allow us to not move this camera when we in fact are in it and have it selected. So that's the basic overall setup. So let's get into how the simulation was set up. I'm going to toggle out of my render camera so we can get an idea of what the scene's looking like. I'm going to drop down my scene null and solo out this one container simulation so that we're not distracted by the other 3. So this is the entire simulation happening in this group here, and you'll see that there are 2 objects that are really driving the whole thing. It's going to be the floor, and it's going to be the container object, which becomes our Voronoi fracture. So how did we set this up? First things first, I modeled a container. I'm not going to go through that modeling process here. We'll just use a primitive object in place to talk about how we got to the Voronoi fracture simulation. And just throw in a basic plane object by going to here, plane, and capsule for our objects. Oops. So first things first, I'm going to take our ground object, I'm going to go to tags, and I'm going to go to simulation tags and collider body. And this is what our container is going to sort of crash into. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select our container object. I'm going to go over to the MoGraph tab and I'm going to select Voronoi fracture. Then I'm going to drop the container into it, and you'll already see that it's already created some initial sort of fracturing elements to it. With the Voronoi fracture object selected, I'm going to go to tags, simulation tags, and add a rigid body tag. And until you play this back, you'll see that we have some initial crashing going on. So now that we have an idea of how the fracture is working, let's try to adjust the fracturing itself a little bit more to our liking. So we can adjust the fracture by selecting our Voronoi fracture object. And when we go over to our attributes panel over here and go to sources, we can go down to this point generator distribution, scroll down and go to the distribution type, select this drop down and hit exponential, and it's going to affect the distribution of our fracture elements. And you can play around with that even more by these axis of affections. And you can turn them on, you can turn them off, you can plus or minus them. I think this is kind of what I'm going for. This is similar to the setup that I had in the other scene. I can play around with it even more by adjusting the seed. And I think this is what I'm liking. I think this is looking good for me. And so again, if we play it back, you'll see we've got even more little elements at the bottom and some larger chunks at the top. For my style frame scene, I didn't want to have the entire thing shatter. I actually wanted the top of it to stay somewhat a little bit together. And the way I achieved that look, if we go into our other file scene, is I added a connector object. So if you select your Voronoi fracture object, you can go over to connectors and you can click this button here called Create Fixed Connector. And when you do that, you'll see that you'll now have created a connector object that's a child to your Voronoi fracture object. If you play this back now with your new connector object, you'll see that the whole thing doesn't break, that we actually have some part of it still staying together. You can adjust these settings by playing with the force and torque amounts. And you'll see that if I up these force amounts, the less will break off. The lower our force amount, the more it breaks off. So yes, once you've gotten it looking the way you want it to look, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to bake this simulation so that you are dealing with the same type of breaking over and over again. So the way you do that is with the Voronoi fracture object selected, you're going to go to tags, MoGraph tags, and MoGraph cache. And here is where you're going to bake your simulation. So we're going to click range. We're going to say from 0 to 90, we're going to bake this simulation. And then we're going to hit the bake button. And so now every time you play this back, you'll get the same simulation over and over. You'll see in my style frame scene that when you drop down the container group, that I have a Voronoi fracture object with the setup that we just did, but I also have a cap. I'm sure there's a proper way to do this with some more simulations-based approaches. I seem to keep running into some issues with that. So what I ultimately ended up doing is I ended up hand animating the cap, and you'll see that animation line here and these keyframes here. So again, that was just my approach to animating the cap along with the simulation. It was a little tedious, but it got the results that I wanted ultimately. And that was how I set up this simulation. So once I was done with the Cinema 4D portion and the 3D elements of this style frame, I simply rendered out a still frame and I brought that into Photoshop. And typically when I'm working on style frames, I'll either jump into Photoshop or After Effects to do any last compositing work. This time around, I decided to jump into Photoshop. And so usually what I do when I jump in there is I'm really just sort of finessing the overall frame. I'm bringing any stock elements, any post effects elements that I'm working with and compositing them to, again, create that finalized look for what the animation or the prominent portions of the animation might feel like. So really quickly, if we hop into Photoshop, you'll see that I use a black and white layer to always check my contrast levels to make sure that nothing's looking very flat. And just very quickly, you'll see that, we've got a still footage, painting in just some lights and darks, bringing in some post-effect particle emissions for some sparks, some flares, noise, and some lens correction to give it a little bit of an analog feel. So that's it for this project. Let's move on to the next one. The next project we're going to talk about is another personal piece that I recently wrapped up for an event called 36 Days of Type Challenge. This is an event that I partake in every year. I've been doing this for the past 3 or so years now. And it's something that happens every year that allows artists from all over the globe to participate. We're talking 3D designers, stop motion people, hand letterers, typographers, graphic designers, illustrators, you name it. Anyone and everyone can participate, and it's really a lot of fun. And it's really great to meet a lot of really cool creative people throughout the challenge. So this year when I participated, I decided to choose a 90s theme from my alphabet. And the purpose behind it was that I really wanted the audience to feel memories from that era, especially if they were kids during that time, like myself. I wanted them to feel some of these childhood memories and feel the nostalgia of the 90s. So I'm specifically going to break down the letter K, which you see here, and the K was for koosh ball. So we're going to talk specifically how I set up a hair setup to create that effect. So now let's jump into Cinema 4D and check that out. So here we are back in Cinema 4D. The file setup is pretty much the same as the last one for the last style frame that I did. Again, you'll see my 3 nulls for my lights, my cameras, and my scene. And again, the approach is the same. I start out with initial dome light. I get a little bit of lighting set up. I set up my camera, fix those attributes to my liking, and then I add a protection tag so that it doesn't move. And so you'll see that here. You'll also see in my Redshift layout that I have this toggled to my render cam so that as I'm moving around the scene, this remains the same. So I'm gonna do that now. I'm gonna toggle out of my camera and we're gonna see the rest of the scene. And the scene is very basic. We have this seamless backdrop and we just have a couple of lights that are in the scene. I have a backlight, which is here, and I have a fill light. Those are being put into the scene as I start to build out the geometry. So let's start to talk about the actual geometry. Let's talk about the K and let's talk about the setup. So this is the foundation and this is the base model for my koosh letter K and the object at which I'm applying my hair to. It's really a combination of cylinders, and in order to make it one object, I'm using a connect to connect the 3 cylinders together. to make it a singular object and apply the hair. So once that's done, once I've created this K foundation, I go up to simulate, I go to hair objects and I add hair. And when I add that hair, it adds this hair object here and also adds this hair material down here. And when you go to your attributes editor, the hair will come in with certain parameters at first. You'll have a count, you'll have a certain amount of segments, and you'll be given a particular length. I think the only thing that I really changed was the length, and I changed that from whatever the initial amount was to 10 centimeters. The next thing that you'll notice when you bring in that hair object is your hair's count. I forget what the initial amount was when it was brought in, but I changed that to 70 because that seemed to be the perfect amount for me to use. The next thing I did is I went over to the hair material and I started to edit that so that I could really start to get the couche look and feel. So the first thing I played with the color. Initially it comes in with sort of a brown gradient, and I tried playing with the gradient at first and I wasn't really getting the look I was hoping for. So the next thing I attempted was I went to this drop down here for texture and I added a noise texture. And when I went into those shader properties, that was where I started to really get some of the couche looks that I was trying to achieve. So within these shader properties, I chose some colors for color 1 and 2, red and yellow respectively. I played around with the seed a bit. And before I even played with the seed, I actually played around with the noise type, which you see here at this drop down. I played with a bunch of these, and ultimately SEMA was the one that looked the best. Played around with the octaves a little bit as well, and ultimately 5 seemed to be the number that worked best. The next thing I did is I went to the specular and I played around with this parameter. Really all I did was I played around with the specular amount, the strength, and I dropped that down to about 25%. And I played with the color a little bit as well because red seemed to be the more dominant color in the distribution of color here. That's how I sort of chose my specular highlight color, and I gave it this kind of pink hue. And so yeah, at a strength of 25% and with this pink hue, it seemed to work pretty well and give me the results I was looking for. The next box I clicked on was the thickness. And now I'm pretty sure that a couche strand, the rubber strand in a couche ball, is the same thickness from root to tip. So I tried that at first. I had 1 centimeter at the root and 1 centimeter at the tip, and it just didn't look right. Every time the render updated, it just didn't feel right. So I ultimately ended up dropping that down to 0.75 centimeters, and that seemed to work. The next thing I played around with was the length, and all I really did here was I played around with the variation amount, and I changed that to 80%. That seemed to work, so that's what I went with. And the next thing that I started to play around with was the frizz. Once I started getting into the frizz, the kink, and the clump properties, that's where I really started to see this come together like a couche ball. So when I came here to the frizz amount, I started playing around with all of these parameters. The frizz effect, you could mess around with and get it really, really frizzy and really out of control. Couche balls aren't really like that though. They are pretty, for lack of a better word, they're pretty uniform to an extent. So I didn't go crazy with the frizz effect. So again, I just left it at 60, or I changed it to 60%. I changed the variation to about 30%. Again, didn't want to give it too much variety because that's not what a couche ball feels like. And the overall frizz effect and amount, I turned down to 75%. The next parameter I played with was the kink effect. And here, all I really did was change the kink effect itself to 50%. I changed the scale to about 80% in both the X and Y axes, and the overall amount I changed to 80%. You'll see that if you crank this up, similar to the frizz, it's gonna really start to get clumpy. It doesn't look like you're seeing the actual strands. So that's why I dropped it down just a little bit. That felt right, that felt good, and so I left it at that. The last parameter that I played around with was the clump, and I really didn't change all that much here. All I really changed was this parameter, which is the clump effect itself. I think it was about 10% to start, and I changed it to 5, and by plugging in 5, that really felt good to me. But you can see that if you change this parameter around enough and you really crank its percentages, you'll get lots of crazy results. Obviously this didn't look very koosh-like to me, so that's why I stuck with a very low amount, like 5%. Once I was done playing around with the hair materials, I noticed that there was a little bit of balding in some small areas, and I wasn't sure if that could be covered up or not, but what I ended up doing, and I think it did help a bit, was I duplicated one of my other materials in the scene, and I did that by holding down Control on my keyboard and dragging over to make a copy, and I double clicked to get into the shader graph and change the color to a red similar to what we have in the scene here, and use this kind of as a base material and a base color for my Connect. And so I dropped that onto my Connect, and I felt it actually did fill in this color here and in some of these other bald spots, and rounded the whole thing out. So that's really it for this scene. It's a pretty straightforward hair setup. Again, you can play around a ton with these settings to your liking. It's a lot of fun. And really that's all it was in order to get this sort of koosh-like effect, was just play around with these settings. In fact, the settings are slightly different for the koosh ball itself, so I threw in a koosh ball as a reference just in case it wasn't completely recognizable. And even some of these settings, although similar in nature to the approach I just went over, some of the settings are just slightly different because of the scale of the koosh ball and the geometry of the koosh ball overall. So that wraps it up for the Cinema 4D portion of this. I'm going to jump back into Photoshop one more time to show you how I approach the compositing end of this. So let's take a look at that real quick before we close this one out. So we're now back in Photoshop, and I'm going to just quickly talk about how I did the compositing portion of this project. It's very similar in nature to the style frame we just covered before this one. So let's check it out. I'm bringing in a render from our Cinema 4D file, and I'll rasterize that so that I can enhance certain areas that are blurred out and sharpen some areas that are more in focus. And then really from there, it's just a matter of playing around with color correction, and then adding in some analog texture. And that'll include noise. That could, again, if I had some other stock elements or pre-rendered elements that I wanted to add for like extra lighting or particles and effects and stuff like that, I could add that in here. I didn't do that for this scene. Really, the only sort of textures that I really added in were noise and some lens correction for some chromatic aberration. And again, always using that black and white layer to check my contrast levels, and you'll see how some of these layers enhance the overall. Well, once I turn this off, you'll see that some of these layers really do add in some extra contrast and really bring our eye to the center of the composition. Just real quick, some of these tips and tricks that I'm sharing now are tips and tricks that I've picked up from industry leaders over the years. So shout out to Ash Thorpe, Matthew Encina, Nydia Diaz. These guys have shared so much knowledge. I really admire their workflow and their processes for developing style frames and animations. So I've definitely adopted some of them, and my workflow is truly a mashup of stuff that I've learned from them and just little tips and tricks that I've picked up while working in the industry over the years as well. So that'll wrap that up for project number 2. That's our koosh letter K. Let's go on to project number 3 and hop back into Cinema 4D. So the last piece we're going to talk about today is a piece that I worked on while I was an artist at the Blaze Network. The show here is the history of currency. It was a 30-minute special that aired on the network. It was sponsored, and when the graphics department was approached to create the graphics package for this show, a couple of the parameters and notes that we were given were they wanted it to feel expensive but not flashy, nothing overly flashy, and they wanted it to feel tasteful. So given that bit of information, we went off and we created a graphics package that fit that description. And one of the elements that was part of that package was what you see here. This was the show introduction, which was a combination of live action and this 3D sequence here. So what we're going to talk about today is how we created this 3D sequence. We're going to talk about the 3D setup and how we did the animation. So let's hop into Cinema 4D one more time and let's check out how we did that. So here we are in Cinema 4D again, one more time. We're going to talk about how we set up the 3D scene for compositing in After Effects for the show introduction that we did. I've already quickly sort of set up some of the initial stuff that I've set up in the past scenes. So yeah, I've got my 3 nulls. I've got a basic dome light in here, which this time around I am actually using an HDRI that I found. I brought that exposure down just a touch so that it wasn't overexposed when I brought it in. I've also set up my render camera, and I've already set up that protection tag so that I don't move it. So everything's in the right place that I want it to be. I've got some pre-lit lighting and for when we bring in geometry. So let's start that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the MoGraph tab and I'm going to go to MoText. And this is going to be the base for my scene. I'm going to drop it into my scene null, and I'm going to start building out the title, the history of currency. So I'm actually going to start with currency because what I'm hoping to do with the text is create some visual hierarchy to create some visual interest. So I'm going to type this in here, and that'll populate in the scene. Well, before I change the font, I am going to change it to middle in terms of alignment. Then I'm going to go to my fonts, and I'm actually going to grab a font that looks very money-like, and it's called Dollar Bill. So I'm going to grab that, and that's going to be the base of our scene. I'm just going to scale that up a bit. And you'll see it updating as I make adjustments here. I'm going to pull this back just a touch. And now that I have my initial text set up, I'm actually going to start playing with it. First thing though is that I'm going to name this layer. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to call it currency. I'm going to play with the depth. So I'm going to actually make it a little bit thicker so that we can actually see some highlights on the edges. Let's make that 125, maybe even 130 or 135. And one more. Okay, that sounds good. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to click caps, and we're going to add a small round bevel to the caps. If it stays completely flat, we won't get any of the light sort of catching on the edge, so that's why we're going to give just a little bevel so that we do catch that light. So that's looking pretty good to me. I'm not going to play with any of the kerning or anything like that. Then I'm going to duplicate this layer. So again, I'm going to hit Control on my PC keyboard, and I'm going to drag up, and this is going to create a copy, and I'm going to pull that up here for now. I'm going to label this history, and I'm going to go back into the object and type in history here as well. And then I'm going to duplicate this again, label this bring this up, type in the here, And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take history again, duplicate that, move it over, label it of, and type in of here. And bring this over. Now I'm just going to play around with the sizing a little bit, again, just to sort of create that visual variety and hierarchy. So let's move currency here. I'm actually going to toggle into my 4 views, and I'm actually going to play with it here, just so that everything stays centered. Once I feel like I've got the right heights and widths and sizes, I'm gonna center it up to my camera. That looks good. I can actually probably keep hitting the wrong key. Drop that down. Drop this down some more. All right, that's looking good. So that looks good to me. We're going to jump out of our front view. I'm going to go back into perspective. And that's looking pretty good. So by duplicating, starting with currency and duplicating every other word, we're obviously preserving the same styles that we initially started with currency, and they're being applied to the rest of these letters here. And we may need to adjust those once we start applying the materials and playing around some more with lighting. So that's going to be the base for our text and our animation. You'll see that I've already sort of created a material that I'm going to use for the text. And basically what I did here is I started out with a basic Redshift material by going to Redshift materials and the standard material. That brought me into here, and I dropped the preset down to gold. So if I duplicate, or I'm not going to even duplicate it. Let's actually go through that motion now. Let's go to materials, material, standard material. It's going to bring this one here. I'm going to go to the drop down and select gold. And this is the basic gold setup that I started out with. Because the final piece that we created had a little bit of like a rose gold tint to it, sorry. All I really did here is I just played around with the color values and the reflectivity and the metal edge tint. And these color combinations gave me that sort of rose gold feel that I was looking for. So I really didn't play much here. It was really just changing this. No other parameters were touched. So I'm going to take my rose gold material and I'm going to apply it to each word. And the way that I actually just did this, in case anyone's wondering, is I select this and again, hold down Control, drag and drop to the next layer. All right, so now we have some basic shading, basic material, basic lighting. I'm really liking how the lighting is creating some of these highlights on the edges and on the bevel. If we really wanted to, we could up the beveling some more on our words. So if we wanted to crank it up to 5, you'll see that we'll get even more of a highlight along that edge. So maybe we'll apply that across the board with relation to the words. So maybe I won't do 5 here, but I'll do 2.5. Yeah, that looks good. History will be about the same as currency. Can maybe drop that down a hair. And maybe we'll put 2, 3, and we'll check that out. Okay. Yeah, that looks good. All right, so yeah, so we're just catching that light ever so slightly, a little bit more by doing that. The next thing we're gonna do is we're going to add some more lights to our scene. So although the HDRI is actually really driving a lot of the nice highlighting that we're having here, I just want to add a little bit more. I want to add a little bit more fill to the words, maybe have a little bit of a drop off here so that you sort of see a gradation of that lighting. And I actually do want to throw in a backlight again to sort of create that separation from foreground and background, and again just create a little bit of highlight in the back. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go to the Redshift tab, I'm going to go to lights, and I'm going to go to area light. And that's going to create this little light down here. I'm going to drag it up. I'm going to scale it up in size in relation to the text. That size feels okay to me. And before I go any further, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a null, because I want to create a focus object for my lights to rotate around. And I'm going to label this null history of currency group. And I'm actually going to take all of my text objects and I'm going to drop it into this new null. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually move the null's anchor point so that it is dead center of the grouping of the word. So I'm going to do that by coming over here and enable this axis. I'm going to jump into my different views, and I'm going to move it into the position that I want this way. Okay, and then I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to jump back into our perspective view. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this area light and I'm going to label it fill, because it's going to be our fill light. And then I'm going to go to tags, animation tags, and target tag. And this target tag is going to allow us to keep the light from, the light's going to keep the light on this subject. So the subject, the target object we're going to use is this group. So I'm going to throw that in there, and you'll see that the light has already adjusted. So now anytime we adjust this light, it's always going to stay focused on our text. So now I'm going to move into the desired position that I want. So I'm going to move it back, move it to the side a bit, scale it up maybe a hair more, bring it up just a touch more. And then now I'm going to go into its attribute settings. I'm going to go down to the intensity. I'm going to drop that down a bit. Okay, so that's looking good to me there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this redshift light by control and dragging up. And I'm going to rename this backlight. It's preserved that target tag, so I know it's going to continue to focus on our text. And I'm going to come here, and I'm just going to position it where I want. I'm going to drop the intensity down a lot. And I'm actually going to color the light this time so that it's not so harsh of a highlight and that it blends into the material. So I actually know a particular hex number that I want for this one, so I'm going to just type that in here. And you'll see that it blends into the font a little bit more. I can even drop this intensity down half. And that looks good. So that's the basic text setup. the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the spline for which we animated the dollar on. So the dollar was also a 3D object. It was a primitive plane that I added a dollar texture to, and I animated it along a handmade spline. So we're going to make that handmade spline next. So in our scene, I'm going to grab our spline pen. I'm going to toggle to our 4 views. I'm going to go to our top view, and I'm going to use this as sort of a basis for the path that we want to create. So with the spline pen tool selected, I'm going to start creating my path. Like so. And I'll click that to get out of it, and you'll see that it's made the plane here. Or I'm sorry, the spline here. I'm going to drag that spline down into our scene, and I'm going to label it dollar spline. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to edit it. I'm going to edit the points on it so that it kind of follows the curvature that I want. But before I do that, I'm just going to raise it up just a touch, and then we'll start editing the points. I'm now going to manipulate the Bezier handles. Okay, that looks like a good enough setup. I'm going to go to the object. I'm going to take a primitive plane object. I'm going to drag that back here to the beginning of the spline. You don't have to do this, but I'm just going to pull it out of focus so I can take a look at it here. I'm going to drop that into our scene. I'm going to call it dollar. I'm going to make it look like a dollar shape for now. That looks good. I'm going to give it just a little bit more information. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select our spline. I'm going to go to tags, animation tags, and align to spline. And this is going to allow us to animate the dollar onto this spline. So spline path we're going to take. Oh, sorry. Actually, that's supposed to be on the dollar. We're going to take this spline path. We're going to put that there, and you'll see automatically the dollar object pops over to our spline. You can then click on this box and it'll orient it to the spline as it moves along it. So as you animate the position, it'll sort of follow that path. Because this is still non-destructible in nature, we can add as much geometry as we need to give it a little bit of a deformation as well. So I'm going to actually up that to 40-50. I'm going to give it a little bit of a bend. And it probably makes sense to do this before adding it to your spline, but we'll just roll with it here. I'm going to rotate this bend deformer. I'm going to position it here. I'm going to see how this is looking. I'm going to rotate it this way, 90 degrees. Perfect. And so as we animate along this path, we can also animate the strength of our bend deformer as it moves. So we can animate this, and we can also animate this. And that is pretty much the basic setup for this scene. The last thing I'm going to talk about real quick is how we set up the animation for the text. So I'm going to go to my text group here, and we're going to use currency as an example. Before I do any animation, I'm going to make this an editable object so that I can play around with the axis rotation of it. So I'm going to bump that up just a little bit so that we are at the center of the object. Come into my views here to make sure that we're at the center or in the middle. Once that looks good, I'll click that back. And then really from here, it's just a matter of animating the position keyframes. So let's say it takes 30 keyframes to move it here and rotate it there. And then I'll just push it back, push it past the camera. Add some rotation. Check these keyframes. And that's going to be the basic setup for our animation. And that's about it for this one. So that's it for my presentation. I just want to say thank you to Maxon for giving me the opportunity to put together this demo for you guys, and thank you all for tuning in and watching. If you'd like to keep in touch, please feel free to follow me on social at the following handles, and thanks again.